Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. I am Dr. Khurram Shahzad. Today, I am going to talk about socio-cognitive discourse studies. Van Dijk, one of the proponents of socio-cognitive discourse studies, has given this approach for analyzing discourse. It is very important that we understand that how socio-cognitive discourse studies it works. Critical discourse studies typically goes beyond such a classical study of the structural properties of text or talk and relates these discourse structures to social structures. It may begin to identify the authors of the texts as editors of a newspaper or as powerful media organization able to influence the opinions of hundreds of thousands of readers. Critical discourse studies not only engages in social and political analyses of the context of text and talk, but more specifically takes an explicit stand or view on the abuse of power a large media organization may have by manipulating the attitudes of readers on immigration, on racism, on political issues and social issues. It explains that and how the symbolic elites of politics and mass media are able to control public discourse and attitudes and thus may contribute to the reproduction of racism and xenophobia in the country. In the structural and critical discourse studies mentioned above and explained in detail in most of the chapters of this handbook, there is still a crucial dimension missing, the socio-cognitive dimension. Socio-cognitive discourse studies more broadly relates discourse structures to social structures via a complex socio-cognitive interface. So we should remember that there are discourse structures and there is society in which discourse is working, but this discourse is you know, related to its structures via socio-cognitive interface. As in cognitive linguistics, socio-cognitive discourse studies critically describes the cognitive aspect of the use of some concepts or metaphors. But more broadly, critical socio-critical cognitive discourse studies deals with the ongoing communicative common ground and the shared social knowledge as well as the attitudes and ideologies of language users as current participants of the communicative situation and as members of social groups and communities. Dear students, once we come to the approach of socio-cognitive discourse studies, we should remember that we have got basic knowledge about discourse. We know what is meant by discourse. We know what is meant by critical discourse. We know what are social groups and social communities or communities. We also know that what is semantics, what is pragmatics, how semantics and pragmatics they are different, and what is the role that semantics and pragmatics they play when we are trying to understand discourse, when we are trying to understand or when we are trying to produce discourse. So it is very important that we have all such knowledges in our mind when we are talking about socio-cognitive approach to critical discourse analysis. Socio-cognitive approach not only makes explicit the fundamental role of mental representations, but also shows that many structures of discourse itself can only or completely be described in terms of various cognitive notions, especially those of information, beliefs, or knowledge of participants. Among many other discourse structures, this is the case for phonological stress, syntactic word order, topic and focus, the structures of proposition, local coherence, relation between propositions, pronouns, and co-reference. global meaning or topics of discourse, indexical expressions, evidentials, terms of appraisal, metaphors, frames, implications, presupposition, and argumentation. Now, once we have the knowledge of all these things, then we are or we can enter into the domain of socio-cognitive approach to critical discourse analysis. So far as the knowledge of topic and focus is concerned, for example, these concepts are coming from systemic functional linguistics. We know that how the sentence is produced, what is the focus of the sentence, what is the topic of the sentence, what is the concept of theme. And in my later lectures, I will be talking about grammar of discourse and I will be explaining all these concepts to you. But one should remember, if you do not have the knowledge of these ideas, these concepts, you won't be able to carry out the socio-cognitive analysis of discourse. For example, proposition, the structures of propositions, pronouns and co-reference, anaphoric reference, cataphoric reference, exophoric reference, homophoric reference. I'll be talking about in other lectures about all these references. Then metaphors, frames, implications, presupposition and argumentation. So of course, presupposition is a concept which is coming from pragmatics. Socio-cognitive discourse studies does so in terms of explicit psychological theories of mental representation, such as individual mental models of journalists or other language users, and the ways these models mediate between shared social cognition, knowledge, attitudes, ideologies, societal structures, and actual text and talk. You should remember that text is produced in the society. You should remember that talk is carried out in the society. And when text is produced in the society, we have the social structure in our mind. We know that what is our relationship with the reader. We know what is our relationship with the listener, what kind of role we are right now playing, what kind of role the listener is having, what is our identity, what is his or her identity. And accordingly, we are producing the discourse. Accordingly, that person is able to understand the kind of discourse that we are producing. So we know that what kind of genre we are writing in. Is it journalistic, editorial, or is it essay, composition in the classroom, or is it some sort of research article for a bigger audience? And what is the structure of that genre? Keeping in mind all these things, we produce our discourse. And then the kind of style that this discourse allows us to produce. There is always academic discourse. When I am checking the assignments of the students, I always keep in mind that how the student is writing academically. Is it academic discourse? Is it academic style that the students is producing or not? Whereas most critical discourse studies describe and explain discourse in terms of its social and political context, socio-cognitive discourse studies goes one crucial step further and includes a cognitive interface between discourse and society. Of course, when discourse is produced, it is produced in society. But how we have that mental model in our mind, that is very important. What is the mental model of that particular event? If we are celebrating a marriage ceremony, we have the schema of that ceremony in our mind. We have the mental model of that event in our mind. How we are supposed to dress up, what kind of scent we are supposed to put on, what kind of relationship we are having, how we are supposed to go over there, how we are going to entertain, how we are going to celebrate that event, what kind of sentences I am going to speak so that the person feels happy. Yes, the person will say, yes, he has participated in our marriage ceremony in an appropriate way. If I am going to join an event where some death has happened, so I know what kind of dress I am supposed to wear. So I have the schema of that event in my mind because I am living in the society. I know that what is the model, mental model of that event and that event which is celebrated or which is carried out in the society, I have a mental model of that event in my mind. So in socio-cognitive approach, discourse, society, and in between these two things, there is an interface of cognition of mind. So different from such other forms of social constructionism, such as discursive psychology, this approach not only holds that such constructions are mental representations implemented by the brain, but also that these mental processes and representations should be taken seriously and analyzed in detail, for example, in terms of contemporary advances in the cognitive sciences. So, what is the cognitive interface? We need to understand now mind, memory, and discourse processing. So, cognitive processes such as thinking, perceiving, knowing, believing, understanding, interpreting, planning, hoping, feeling, all these concepts, all these ideas, they take place in the mind or memory of individual social actor as members of social groups and communities. So, we are social actors. My role in the university is of a teacher. So I am acting as a social actor in the classroom. What is my identity? I know who is sitting in front of me, what kind of dress I should put on, how I am going to plan my lecture, how I am going to deliver my lecture. I always have some mental models, the representation of that event in my mind, and then accordingly I go over there. So thinking, perceiving, knowing, believing, understanding, planning, all these things I perform in my mind. And then my role as a producer of the text, as a producer of the talk, as my identity and identity of my students, all these things are very important. These cognitive processes in memory are implemented in the various regions of the brain, made explicit in neuropsychology. Further, yet relevant to know about the relation between discourse and brain is that brain, it has got its own illnesses, accidents, disorders as well, which are called aphasia. Cognitive processes in memory operate on specific cognitive structures, usually called representations. So, forming, changing, storing, activating, thus, thoughts, knowledge, belief, interpretations, plans, attitudes, or ideologies are different kinds of mental representations. So in mind, we have got, cognitive processes and representations of cause and control, which all human beings or human actions and interactions, and hence also language use and discourse. We partly describe and explain discourse in terms of these underlying properties of the mind. You should remember that we have got short term memory and we have got long term memory. Short term memory is also called working memory. So, in short term memory, which is a working memory, online processes of attention, understanding, or production of action takes place, often in fractions of a second and with the limited information stored in the memory buffer of working memory. Long term memory stores the results of these processes, for example, in the form of knowledge or beliefs, which may be activated and thus again by working memory for future operations. For example, when we remember something or when we need that information for perception, action, or discourse. So we have our knowledge, which is stored in our long-term memory, and whenever our working memory requires that knowledge from long-term memory, it shifts to the working memory, and within fractions of a seconds or minutes, our mind, it processes all these things so fast. So there is discourse production and comprehension. So we should remember that we have got very complex cognitive processes and they are operating in our working memory. For example, for the processing of sounds, images, phonemes, morphemes, lexical items, syntactic structures, local and global meanings, overall patterns of text and talk, and structures and strategies of interaction, all these things are there in our mind. Our mind, it processes the sounds which are coming from the speaker to me, and while traveling in the air, it is going in my ears, and from my ears in my mind. So I try to understand that what kinds of sounds are there, what kind of morphemes are there, what kind of lexical items are there, what kind of syntactic structures are there. And my mind processes all these things accordingly and very fast. And then I am in a position, keeping in mind my role, keeping in mind my identity, keeping in mind the society where I am working as a teacher, I produce relevant answer to that discourse. So my mind, it processes the ideas very quickly, and then it helps me in the production of that those ideas. So one of the many problems to be resolved of these many complex parallel processes involved in the production and understanding of discourse is how they are controlled and coordinated in fractions of a second. With full pages of descriptions are required if we want to write all these things. So full pages, description is required, which is very difficult to give. The process of language use and discourse activate and apply specific linguistic and discursive knowledge systems of units, rules, and strategies in long-term memory, such as those of grammar, lexicon, local and global semantics, pragmatics, conversation, and other forms of interaction. So our mind processes all these things very quickly. We have got sounds, we have got images, we have got lexical items, we have got syntactic structures, and syntactic structures, they are composed of complex structures, and then those complex structures, we process them in our mind, and then we are able to produce them in the form of discourse, keeping in mind with whom we are interacting, what is our relationship with that person, what are our goals, what is my role in the society, and how I want to achieve those goals with the help of discourse that I am producing. So cognitive psychology of discourse specifically also focuses on the description and explanation of higher level processing of discourse. Then we should remember that there are personal cognitions and mental models. Whereas traditionally the semantics of language and discourse was limited to the description of local or global meaning, for example, in terms of propositions. So always sentences are produced, and these sentences, they have got different propositions, different meanings. It has got different structures. It has got subject. It has got, you know, uh, goals. It has got focus in it. Cognitive psychology has shown that such meanings are based on underlying mental models. Mental models are subjective representation of events or situations in episodic or autobiographical memory. So all these models, they are residing in our mind and they are working very fast. So since we observe, participate, or talk about events many thousands of times in our lives, mental models have a standard schematic structure. So we have got schematic structures. We have got schema in our mind. As I have already given you the example, that how do we celebrate marriages? How do we participate in death events? How do we carry out different kinds of events in different kinds of places? How do we react to the people? How do we read? How do we produce different kinds of discourse structures, argumentation, persuasion? So we have got schematic structure here. And this schematic structure, keeping in mind the genre, keeping in mind the style, we produce discourse. So producing a meaningful discourse about an event such as story or news article involves the partial expression of a mental model of that event. Similarly, understanding such a discourse consists in the construction or updating of a mental model of the event. Mental models are individual, personal, subjective, and multi-models. Of course, no doubt, society plays its role. So we have seen in the society how do our elders, they celebrate different kinds of events. So we have got those structures in our mind. For example, these days I am checking some of the essays of the students about Pakistan in 2047, when it will become of 100 years of age. So they have got their mental models of Pakistan, that how Pakistan is going to play a positive role in 2047. And what kind of things will be there in Pakistan? No one wants extremism or terrorism in Pakistan. No one wants that there should be poverty in Pakistan. So students, they have talked about that we want that Pakistan should be free from poverty. Pakistan should be free from extremism. Pakistan should be free from terrorism. So these mental models, they work along with the social models that we have got. Semantic models which are there in our mind, pragmatic models that which are there in our mind, and contextual knowledge that we have got. Context, I have already talked about. It is linguistic, it is socio-cultural, it is cognitive, because we know in what kind of situation we are in, what is our role, what is our relationship with the participant we are interacting with, what are the goals that we want to achieve. So of course, then accordingly we are producing discourse. So we cannot eliminate the discourse, the role of discourse in society, and we cannot eliminate the role of cognition from the discourse that we are producing in the society. For all mental models, contextual models consist of schematic structures such as setting, participants, and actions, but then they are specified for communicative action. So we know that the speech acts that we are producing in pragmatics, we will talk about the speech acts, assertives, declaratives, okay, expressives. Sometimes we are passing, judgments. Sometimes we are giving directions to the other people. Sometimes we are making commitments with the kind of discourse that we are producing. And sometimes we are expressing our feelings and emotions, and the role of conversational implicature and the role of conversation, conversational truths. Grice, who talked about four maxims: maxim of quality, quantity, relevance, manner, all play a very important role when we are producing the discourse. We should not tell a lie, we should be truthful, we should speak the discourse which is required in the context, which is required in the setting. We should not speak more, we should not speak less, we should be relevant. So, pragmatically speaking, we must have the knowledge of all these things. When these things are there in our discourse, and when we are producing the discourse, keeping in mind all these things, then we can say that our discourse, it is having a social as well as cognitive role. So these are some of the things that we have talked about. But of course, in social cognition, knowledge and attitudes and ideologies, they are also very important, because our society, it is made up of cultures. We have got cultures, we have got norms, we have got values. So when we are producing the discourse, we know what are our values, what are the values of our listeners, what we can produce, what we can say, what we cannot say. So once you have the knowledge of the social models as well as the knowledge of cognitive models, we are producing the discourse. So when Dijk talks about the socio-cognitive approach to studying, to analyzing, to understanding the kind of discourse that we are analyzing. So of course they have talked about various other projects, like they talk about Cameron, and in America and UK, immigration is one of the topics that people usually are interested in. They do not want that we Pakistanis or Indians or Sri Lankans or Bangladeshis, we should be going to their country. They feel that this is not good. So their politicians, they produce the discourse. Their politicians, they speak against immigration rules, and they want that immigration should be stopped, or some strict rules should be applied, so that every Tom, Dick, and Harry should not be going to their country. Only those people who are highly educated should move to their country. Coming to Pakistan, we have got different, social actors. We have got political leaders. So, for example, our ex-Prime Minister Imran Khan, these days when he is delivering these speeches, he knows that what kind of society he is in. He very much clearly talks about religion in his speeches. So he starts with the name of Allah Almighty. He talks about iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in, and then he brings in Islam into his speeches, because he knows that what is the mind of the people, what is the social role of the people, what kind of mindset they have got, what kind of mental models that they accept. So accordingly, he produces the speeches, accordingly, he produces the discourse in order to win the hearts and minds of the people. So just 2 or 3 days ago, I was watching his speech, and he was bringing intertextuality in his speech, showing the current Prime Minister of Pakistan, Shehbaz Sharif, and the kinds of mistakes that he was making when he was producing discourse. So, in political discourse, you know that we always show our strong points and we show the weak points of our opponents. So, Imran Khan was showing the weak points of his opponents, because he knows it very well that discourse, it has got a social role, and discourse, it is produced keeping in mind the mental models, the schematic models which are in our mind. We cannot eliminate the role of Islam. It is ingrained here in our mind. So he produces Islamic discourse in his speeches, in his discourse, in his talk, so that he should be able to win the hearts and minds of the people. And same is the case with the other political leaders as well. They also produce discourse keeping in mind that what the people believe in, what they are thinking, what they are believing. For example, these days, dearness, mehengai is one of the issues of Pakistanis. So our political leaders will be talking about them. Our political leaders will be framing the concept of dearness in their discourse, in their text and talk. Imran Khan also talks about dearness, mehengai in his speeches, because people are affected by dearness. People cannot afford to buy expensive things. So he knows that mentally what they are thinking. So he has got his concept of, you know, Pakistan, that if he is elected in the next elections, he will bring drastic changes, positive changes in the society. So he produces such type of discourse where Pakistan will be free of terrorism, extremism, and poverty. So he talks about, he gives a new slogan, Hum Ghulam hain kya? Are we slaves to the other nations? So such type of discourse is produced, keeping in mind the mental level, the mental models of the people, the representation of the ideas which is there in the mind of the people, the kind of discourse which is there in the society, the kind of social issues that people are facing these days. This is how discourse is produced. So, in order to analyze or apply socio-cognitive approach to critical discourse analysis, we will have to focus on the text first of all. Text which is in the form of written discourse or spoken discourse which is transcribed. We will have to see what is our agenda. Why do we want to analyze this discourse? Accordingly, we will have to collect the data, and then we will have to read the text time and again. We will have to do close reading of that text and see that what kind of metaphors the authors they are making use of, what kind of text they are producing, similes and metaphors, literary devices, linguistic devices the authors are making use of, the kind of references. For example, iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in, we are bringing in Islam. If I remember way back, Dr. Tahirul Qadri, he was trying to create similarity between the ex-Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif and Yazid. So he was saying that Yazid is sitting in the Prime Minister house. So we should go and we should, free Pakistan from such type of people. So he was using metaphorical language. He was creating the mental model of the people. He was giving the mental representation of the ex-Prime Minister. So this is how language is manipulated. So we will have to see the kinds of sentences, the kinds of words, the semantics of those words, the pragmatics of those words, of those sentences, that how they are being produced in the society, with the people, what they believe in, what they like. So accordingly, we will have to analyze the text and then relate that text with the society in which it is produced, with the cognition of the people, that what they are thinking, what they like, what they do not like. So this is how socio-cognitive analysis of critical discourse, studies will be carried out. Thank you very much.